Yeah, let's try to talk for maybe an hour at the most,
Okay.
partly because my battery on my headphones might run out after that. um, and I'll just let you lead it. I think I'll probably discuss where. Okay, this is Stephan Kinsella, by the way. This is going to be the Kinsella on Liberty podcast, and I'm doing not really a debate, but a discussion about IP with, and I think a guy named Voice of Reason. I guess you're going to be anonymous, and I think you're an objectivist leaning libertarian type person. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thanks for having me on, Stefan.
And by your accent, I assume you're not in the US.
Well, I actually am in the U.S. I'm not too far from you. I live in Austin, Texas.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so um, look forward to meeting you in person one of these days. Next time you're in Austin,
Yep.
shoot me a note and we can grab some coffee or something.
Okay. Um, well, let me, if you can interject if you like, but so you and I were just, this is over a month ago now, so honestly, I've forgotten, but you and I were kind of spatting over IP, intellectual property, on some Twitter or other thread somewhere. And so we decided to just talk about it. I think we come at it from different angles, and I wanted a chance to try to see where we disagree, see if there's common ground, see if I can understand where you're coming from, and maybe uh, explain my position better, which is misinterpreted all the time by objectivist type people. Does that sound roughly like what you wanted to do today?
Yeah, I think it would be a good opportunity to share some ideas. We actually have a lot of things in common. We do disagree on the topic of intellectual property, but I think in general we are for um, rights and property rights, and certainly for capitalism and things like that. So there's a lot of common ground, but this is an area where we don't agree, and let's explore that and let's see. Let's my recommendation, if you don't mind, I think we can just get to fundamentals
Yep.
and try to discuss it at that level. And I'm not a lawyer. I will say that up front. So I'm not here to, um, debate the finer points of law. Certainly, I'm not here to talk about, for example, whether one can or should get a patent on crustless peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in bags or something like that. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to make a moral case for intellectual property. And I've heard you say, Stefan, I think this echoes Ayn Rand's view, the moral is the practical. So
Absolutely.
if we can establish a moral case, then we can talk about practical things. So
Yep.
that's I think a better place to start.
I agree. I don't know if you remember the famous exchange between Reagan and uh, one of his opponents, where Reagan says, "I won't hold my opponent's youth and inexperience over him." So I hope you won't hold my being a lawyer over me against me. it's definitely not. It's definitely not to your discredit that you're not a lawyer, and you don't need to be a lawyer to understand or have an opinion on these things. And as for the details of peanut butter sandwiches and all that, yeah, the problem is when I point out examples, crazy examples like that, then all my opponents always say, "Well, I agree with you on that. I'm not in favor of that." So all they can do is add in an ad hoc way, keep telling me what they don't agree with. Like, so every concrete example I give of an obvious outrage that comes from intellectual property law, they agree with me on, but then they say, but that's not what I'm in favor of. And then I'm left saying, well, then what the hell are you in favor of? So the only way to discuss it is to have like a discussion on principles and fundamentals. So I agree with you. So let's talk about what morals are, or what's right and wrong, and then what rights are and what our principles are and what we share in common. I mean, are you an objectivist, or are you a libertarian, or are you an anarchist? Where are you on those issues? Let me just ask you that before we get started.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I think it's good to go into that before we get into details of my position. So let me begin by saying that I'm a fan of Austrian economics. I mean,
Okay.
the fact that I disagree with you on intellectual property, uh, I still, by the way, respect the fact that you're grappling with a key issue here. And like you, I too was influenced by Ayn Rand's books as a youngster. Rand actually helped me form an intellectual basis, from which I could grasp the concepts of capitalism. And
Me,
that
me
was a
too. Me too. By the way, me too. And by the way, your name, Voice of Reason. If people don't know, that is the name of an Ayn Rand book,
yes, it is. Thank you for mentioning that. And you
The
see
Voice of Reason.
the the image that you might be seeing on the screen is actually from the cover of one of the editions. It's the
Ah,
classic
the
New York City with
Twin
the
Towers. Yeah.
twin towers with the lights going off, which is, you may
Mm,
recall,
mm-hmm.
is the
Oh,
end point of Atlas Shrugged when the
right.
lights on New
Yep.
York City.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's
Yep.
kind of where I made the image as well. So
I think we're on the same page so far. So keep going.
great. So for me, it was kind of natural that I found my way to Austrian economics. I learned from reading Menger and von Bawerk and von Mises and others. So I think we share a lot in common
Well,
there as well.
what about Rothbard and Hoppe? Just curious.
I have some disagreements with, so Hoppe I view as a philosopher,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and he approaches ethics in a way you're familiar with it. You've spoken many times on argumentation ethics. I don't have to tell you about it, but so I believe that there is um, an a good intent there to try and get to normative principles,
Right.
but it starts with some. I think there's a sort of a, when you start philosophizing midway without getting to fundamentals, because you have let's say a Kantian straitjacket. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
Yep.
getting a little ahead of myself here.
Yep. No, I know where you're going. I know that's the Randian critique, is that you need a comprehensive philosophy to ground everything else in. And I think to an extent that's of course true. It doesn't have to be as comprehensive as the Randians. You don't have to know about aesthetics, for example, to have a rights theory. But yeah, you have to have a sound overall worldview. You have to have a sound epistemology, a sound metaphysics, even a sound ethics like individualism, egoism, that kind of stuff. However, I think Hoppe and the realist Kantians and Misesians basically have that by default, um, or by common sense, even though the terminology is different. Like I think that Hoppe, this is getting far afield, but I believe that there is a strain of Kantianism on the European continent that is more realistic and compatible with Rand's own worldview than the American idealistic interpretation, which is what she was critiquing. But anyway, that's it. That's
Yeah,
probably
we can get
too
into
far.
that, and incidentally, I'm perfectly happy to have other conversations with you
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
on ethics in particular. So just to get back to more of an introduction, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So Austrian economics answered many of my questions in economics, but having been exposed to objectivism, I I felt that there were some problems at the philosophical root of Austrian economics, which
Mm-hmm.
I view as the root being essentially Kantian. So
Mm-hmm.
it's to me it felt like I was entering this amazing, impressive building, and then suddenly realizing that it needs a better foundation. That
Yeah,
was my take when I read the amazing work. So that's, to me, IP represents a case in point, particularly since the leaders in Austrian thought hold such divergent views. The views of von Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe and others diverge considerably. So this is when one must be, at some level, a philosophical detective, as I like to call it. So that's
that's
when you
all.
have to.
That's all reasonable and fine so far. I agree with you on that.
Great. So that's, and just one more thing, because I want to stress that we have a lot in common here. Um, I also recognize that, when Karl Menger, and in the 19th century, the founder of Austrian economics, was doing his major work, um, Kantian philosophy dominated the era, and also in early 20th century, when Mises was making his pioneering contribution. So one can respect and admire the founders and the leading thought people in Austrian economics. In fact, I admire the fact that they could accomplish all these great things in spite of
Correct.
having a philosophy that was, it was kind of a smorgasbord if you think about it.
I agree. That,
We'll
that
take
that's why.
We'll take the epistemology, which I question. We'll ditch the duty ethics or deontology. We'll ditch that. We'll form our own. So they did what they had to do in making great economics.
Well,
But
this is why I think that these guys that you think are Kantians, I think they implicitly or by default have an essentially correct and realistic view. Um, I think it's in a sense not as hard as we think it is. I mean, everyone has to live in the world, so we even though we compartmentalize and we pretend, ultimately most people are realists and practical and pragmatic, and this forces us to, I don't know, I think that's one reason. So like there's intuitions, there's common sense that keeps us from going too far. Even with this transgender stuff and all this modern crap, people only take it so far. You might say that reality is not real, but most people don't walk out of a high-rise building, assuming they won't die. They really just don't, even though.
mhm,
So people, when they're forced to choose. But anyway, that's an interesting point. So I'm with you so far on that.
okay.
Um,
So
but
just
go
to
ahead.
just to um, so the point is also that Rand had the benefit of um, first, obviously, knowing about Kantian philosophy, knowing the problems there, and then also reading the works of Mises and others, also recognizing that, in a sense, only those of us who lived in the 20th century or even the 19th century could appreciate that the man's use of reason actually leads to good things. So it was difficult to reach these kind of inductive conclusions at the time, predating, and like certainly in the Lockean era, it was difficult for anyone to say something like, "Oh yeah, and there'll be prosperity of this type." So there's an inductive process that you benefit from having seen and having studied history, and Rand then puts the pieces of that together. And I think there's so to me it's always been Mises and Rand. It's never been, oh, you have to make a false choice. You either are all in for Mises or all in for Rand, and
Oh,
that's what.
by the way, I totally agree with that. And by the way, Ayn Rand, to her credit, and uncharacteristically for her in a sense, because she actually made a lot of allowances for Mises's, say, deviations that she would view them. Like she obviously saw through his Kantian terminology or whatever. Like she didn't freak out about his so-called subjectivism, which I think actually she's right to not do that, because his subjectivism is compatible. His subjectivism is just the concept of value, which is actually compatible with her concept of value being and something that a person acts to gain or keep, which is the exact same thing as demonstrated preference, which is the root of Mises' subjective preference idea. So he's not a subjectivist in the sense that Randians use it in a pejorative to mean ethical relativism or something like that. Or maybe he was, but that wasn't what he was talking about in economics. So I think
Well,
Rand actually appreciated Mises. I mean, she recommended him in her book, and she criticized Hayek, to her credit too. So I think Rand actually saw the good in Mises, and I agree with you. Rand was essential for me in building sort of a systematic framework way of approaching all this.
yes, and just to also touch on what you said, the ethical relativism. I would recommend looking at the article that Rothbard wrote on Mises' ethical relativism. He actually used the word that Mises was tragically wrong in his ethics.
Yeah,
So I would just say, and I'm a big fan of Mises. So this is
me
not
too.
to I mean, how do you make such incredible economics when you're living in an era which is dominated by bad philosophy, and you're accepting some parts of it? So this is not by any means a criticism. It's just a means
No,
of saying that there's a correction that is needed. Rothbard was certainly more Aristotelian than Kantian, but he went far enough to describe Mises' ethical relativism as tragically wrong or tragically flawed, I think is the word he used. But he didn't apply what he could have done was take a value-based approach and actually fix the fundamentals. Now, there's a lot of historical reasons why that was, but that's not necessary to say. But my point is, actually, I'm here to make that moral case, I'm here to discuss rights, which I would point out are a term from political philosophy, not economics. So we have to, we have to examine the definitions that economists take for granted. We
I,
can't
I
just,
I totally agree. And by the way, we need to, and we'll do this as we get along, but we need to have a careful definition of what we mean by intellectual property, and we can get to that. And
okay?
by the way, Mises, to his credit, he never claimed to be a big ethical philosopher, as far as I know. So, he wasn't, but you can't fault him because he didn't pretend to be, at least.
That's fair, but that what that tells us is that either you have to divorce ethics from economics, which is what he did. He essentially said that values-free economics means that you don't really have to worry about the ethical component of it, and that was one way. So in my mind, Mises had a choice. He could either do what I would call disintegration, which is take Kantian ethics and try to somehow integrate it with his great economics, which would never work. So he would end up disintegrating his economics if he tried to do that. Since he couldn't do that, he just said, let's create a silo. Let's
Maybe,
separate. Yeah.
maybe. I just think that just wasn't his focus. He was, I mean, I think maybe it's trying too hard to do this. I mean, to read too much into it. Economics is wortfrei, is value free in the sense that the nature of what economics is, and even Reisman talks about this. Reisman has a idiosyncratic view of it, like it's the study of how wealth is produced or something. But even that is descriptive. That's not but the point is, economics is an analytical. It analyzes the consequences of human action. So in that sense, it's value free. But as like Hoppe might observe, it doesn't assume that people don't have values. They have values. So it's just a study of the implications of people acting based upon their values. But in other words, recognizing the different scientific disciplines are distinct is not to separate them, as you said. It's just to recognize that they're distinct. I mean, astronomy is different than mathematics, and physics is different than biology, and ethics is different than aesthetics. There doesn't mean they're not linked or related, right? But they're just distinct fields of knowledge.
But that's the point. The point, you actually said it very well. The point is that concepts from ethics should not be so separated. So, for example, ethics deals with values, and if you say that economics cannot deal with that, that is like saying atomic theory works in physics, but it doesn't work in
Right.
chemistry. So
Yeah,
you have a
but
choice. You
that's
don't have to apply it.
I,
If you want to
I agree
specialize in
with you.
economics, yeah,
I agree, but I think that's a bit of a straw man because economics doesn't say that it can't deal with it. It simply says that economics is the science that deals with the logical and practical implications of the fact that people have choice and they act. And we analyze what that means: supply and demand, cost and profit and loss, and opportunity costs, and these kinds of things. And then other phenomena like interest rates and trade and and minimum wage and unemployment and all this kind of stuff. So that's what economics deals with. It doesn't mean that it's not relevant. I mean, I don't think you can be a good libertarian, for example, if you don't know something as a factual matter about history, about human nature, sociology, psychology, ethics, aesthetics. I mean, maybe not aesthetics, but epistemology, philosophy, metaphysics. All these things are relevant. I mean, know what you if you don't have language, you can't even talk. So all these things bear on each other. Nothing is not interconnected in the universe. Um, but that doesn't mean that recognizing that one domain is distinct from another is to so-called separate them. It's just to recognize that they're distinct. I mean, to have categories, to have words, to have concepts, to have language is to distinguish things and to discriminate in the sense, right? There's nothing
absolutely.
wrong with that per se.
I like the way you put that. So there is so reality is interconnected. Therefore, our knowledge of it should also be integrated. So for
Completely agree. Completely agree.
and in that sense, if someone makes the comment that you can discuss, you should make something values free because to introduce values would somehow cause a disintegration, it was probably the right thing to do in the Kantian framework, because if you try to integrate it with deontology, you'd be in big trouble. But the point is, if we have a better system that allows us to integrate, so I would even argue that praxeology is a layer, an action, call it a layer of action that Mises had to create, because he could not bring Kantian values into economics. He had to create a sort of a separation layer called praxeology as a starting point. So separating values from action was needed because of the Kantian straitjacket. You,
Maybe, and I think this gets us far afield, but that's interesting, maybe. But there's nothing wrong with saying, here's how supply and demand works. And that is not a moral evaluation. That is just like the logic of what it means to act. Like there's supply, there's demand, there's opportunity cost. If you impose a minimum wage, you will tend to increase unemployment. That's not evaluative. You can link it in with it. The only reason you're interested is because you have some values of exploring knowledge or learning things or furthering human welfare or whatever, and they're all connected. That's true. In fact, my view is philosophically, to exist means to have an effect on something else. But I think that's what it means. That's why I think when people say, "Oh, there's alternate universes that are parallel universes that are next to us, but they don't affect us," I think that means they literally don't exist because they have no effect on us, even in principle. But that's philosophical. And by the way, I think my case against IP does not rest upon this entire Austrian praxeological Kantian or neo-Kantian framework whatsoever. It's buttressed by it, but that's incidental. I think the case against IP comes from a clear recognition of our pro property rights, pro individual rights principles, and understanding what property rights are. Just simply recognizing there's a contradiction there. There's an incompatibility. So that's my perspective on it. But go ahead.
yeah,
I
just
think
to
that's enough background probably. Why don't you take it the way you want to take it, and I'll follow your lead.
Fair enough, but I just want to say that when we are talking, just to finish the thought on the Kantian, what I call the straitjacket, and you're free to disagree with that. To me, when you create these separations and then you introduce concepts like the Menger's, he had a structure, a mental structure of wants.
Mm-hmm.
So that is in a way bringing in, since he couldn't make the connection to values, he creates a structure of wants. Similarly, Mises creates a structure, a Kantian structure of action, and that's where praxeology comes along. And then
Well,
Harper
yeah,
creates
go ahead.
a structure of essentially argumentation and discourse. So each one of these things, so you either have the Kantian system in your thinking, and that drives you in a certain direction. It might even limit what you can do. If I may just say one more thing. So, for example, if you're not if you're not in the inductive mode of observing and then abstracting, then you also put another straitjacket on yourself where only new information can only come from introspection. So now you have things like, if there's a performative contradiction,
I,
yeah, now you got new information. But
yep,
other than
yep,
that,
yep, yep,
all your
yep,
starting points have to come from there.
yep.
So
And by the
it
yeah,
impacts every aspect of what we do. And
yeah.
so, yeah, go ahead.
Let me say something. I don't know how this may be lost on most people listening, unless they're deep into Randy and stuff. I agree with so much of what you're saying, although people wouldn't think I do. Um, Except you're talking from a Randian point of view so much, about induction and all this stuff, and part of it rests upon, I think, an unfair caricature or straw manning of the other side. Like, to the extent Rand was correct in portraying what the Kantians believe, she was right to mock it. David Kelly has this famous line, like when Kant says, like, the senses should conform to our reality should conform to what we experience and all this. Yeah, that's obviously silly, but I think he meant something subtly different, and that's Kant's fault that he was so murky, and even Hoppe recognizes this. But um, I think that reality is what reality is. So I'm a Randian in that sense, and I believe that if there's another species on another planet, they would have different concepts, different history, a different mode of communication, but ultimately they're describing the same reality. And it is true that a different conceptual and linguistic framework could lead you astray. But if you keep reality as your touchstone, you can make any system basically work. It's like the different guys looking at the elephant from different angles, the tail, the feet, the trunk. They think they see different things, but they're all observing different parts of reality, which is also part of my pro-Randian the moral is the practical view. Like, it's not surprising to me that consequentialism, as some people call it, dovetails with deontological truths. I don't think that Hoppe is this, and these guys are this caricature of like, oh, they're trying to deduce everything a priori. In fact, I think Hoppe's argumentation ethics is perfectly compatible with and complements the good part of Rand's approach for rights, because like even Ayn Rand herself had this assertoric hypothetical approach to ethics. Like, if you choose to live, then this is what follows from it, right? Even she didn't try to say you go from is to ought. You go from the fact of man's nature to what he should do. She went from the fact that he has values to what those values imply. And that's what Hoppe does in his argumentation ethics. But
We,
that gets
we,
us
we
far
can,
afield.
yeah, and we can
Yeah,
talk about maybe ethics another time if you're open to. I'd love to you know hash that out with you as well, because I think I would push back slightly in the sense that I I don't think that Harper um, starts. So the problem is it doesn't get to the fundamentals. If you are unable to look at facts of life as a starting point and then induce from there, then you're constraining yourself to operating at a level that is removed from that. And that's actually where many errors are possible. So
I, I
when you're
agree. I
picking a
agree with all that.
methodology, then your methodological approach should be, let's find the method that minimizes our chances of error. Error is still possible. Humans are fallible. But
Correct.
let's find the way that at least puts the, the our senses give us information. Let's put that ahead of abstraction. Let's not put abstraction ahead of sense.
By the way, I agree with all that, and I am more Aristotelian, Randian in this whole approach. By the way, I think David Kelly is one of the great geniuses in all this, although I disagree with him on the free will part. But um, I think that the essential thing is whether you're correct or not the terminology. So we have to, keep our eye on that. Um,
Agreed. But it's also
and
important to get to fundamentals. So when we
It
say,
it is. But what's interesting is you keep focusing on Hoppe's argumentation ethics. That's not epistemological at all. That's just like his argument for rights, which okay, we could just that's another topic, but I think is actually compatible with probably your view and Rand's view, although she wouldn't admit it. But the the real contribution of Hoppe would be his, and I don't know if you are familiar with this or read it, but his economic science in the Austrian method, his
I have.
epistemology. So I think that is, you might disagree with the terminology, and you might think it's overly Kantian, but it is essentially realistic. He's attempting to combine the 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 realm that we experience, the perceptual realm, right, with the action realm. So the teleological realm, the causal realm. He's trying to unite those into a realistic framework. Maybe he failed, maybe he succeeded, maybe he's overstating his case, but it's not a dishonest uh, or an evil attempt to try to make us think that we don't live in reality and we don't really know what's going on. It's very realist centered. It's very grounded in pragmatics and in the things Rand emphasizes, but just with different terminology.
Oh, there's nothing evil about it. Don't get me wrong. Hopper is a brilliant man. Uh, I mean, the point is he has his and his I guess until his 30s he was a Kantian Marxist
No, no,
some
no.
type.
I don't think it was that late, but yeah, it was till his late 20s maybe, but
Fair
whatever.
enough.
Yeah.
His background is in from Kant, and I would say he did not explore a perfect, a better alternative to Kant that was available in that era, and that's
No,
what my only criticism
no,
of
no, no,
Hopper.
no. And I don't. So the reason I brought up evil is because Randians make this extremely hyperbolic claim that Kant is the source of all evil in the world and blah blah blah. And even that claim is exaggerated, but it's based upon this caricature or this American idealistic, skeptical, moral relativist, not moral relativist, but epistemological relativist interpretation of Kant, which, as even Hoppe concedes, is partly Kant's fault because he was so murky and unclear in his writing. So Hoppe says, I don't agree that Kant meant this, but I can understand why some people think so because he was so vague. Okay. And I agree with you that like Hoppe is a little bit too dismissive of Rand's contributions, partly because he was a Rothbard follower and Rothbard had a falling out with Rand because they were totally psychos and cultists and she was, like all this personal stuff. But even Hoppe acknowledges that Rand didn't have personal knowledge of Kant. She wasn't a deep Kant scholar, but she had some points about her criticism of the idealistic interpretation of Kant. But anyway, this is interesting to me and you, I'm sure, but we're getting way far afield for what we wanted to talk about. Which, by the way, so you still never answered the question. Are you an anarchist and are you a libertarian? And do you believe in what's your view of property rights? Why don't you talk about that? And then we can get into the
Okay,
next steps.
sure. I am not an anarchist.
Okay.
I am an objectivist in the sense that I and this is all the way from metaphysics, epistemology, the nature of man, ethics, politics, economics, even aesthetics. To me, there's a system that is available, and if there was a better one, honestly, I would be for it. So I'm not in it to. I'm not a card carrying, supporter of anybody. But what
Yeah.
I'm looking for is the best way to explain the world that I live in, which
Yeah.
means a lot to me. So, for example, if Hopper had examined the Ayn Rand's approach, because he was coming of age in the 70s when certainly it was available to him. So let's to me the people like Rand and Mises are they did amazing contributions, but they've been gone for like 4 decades. So to be hung up on the personalities makes no sense at all. The better thing for us to do in the 21st century, focus on the ideas, and let's not worry about whether Rothbard and Rand had a falling out. It's
Totally with you. I
yeah,
totally agree. And by the way, you might not know this, but I consider myself to be an objectivist in the sense of I agree with at least the four main tenets. I don't even say I disagree with the aesthetics with the fifth, but I'm not like it. I'm not obsessed with aesthetics, and I don't pretend to be an expert. But like on metaphysics, on epistemology, on ethics, and on economics and politics, I agree with the general way she stated it. I agree with capitalism or individual rights. I agree with individual self-interest or egoism. I agree with reality and realism. I agree with, the basic core stuff. I think she misapplied it in some ways, and she was too grandiose. But I agree with all that, by the way, and I think they all feed back on each other and they all interplay with each other. However, I'm not too dismissive of other conceptual frameworks, linguistic frameworks, philosophical frameworks that also contribute and express these core ideas in different ways, although less precisely sometimes and with more contradictions. But yeah, essentially, I'm a Randian at my core. I think. I think
great.
she was wrong about, and anarchy is we can forget the anarchy thing. I think she just was wrong there, but that's a different but on IP, I think her fundamental failure was in her self-contradictory rights theorizing. She was right on half of it and wrong on half of it, and that led to conflict, and that leads to her conflating different domains and supporting intellectual property. That's what I think her essential mistake is. But I agree with the core, like realism, individualism, reality is reality, logic, rationality, reason, uh, capitalism, all that. So I think I'm with you on the core.
Great. And maybe this is a good time to get into more specifics.
Go ahead.
Having and you mentioned in some of your podcasts, which by the way I enjoy, um, where you've described your journey through objectivism, and you've even mentioned in some places that you got into IP law because of objectivism, and then you perhaps didn't found out other things about it and changed your mind about it, which is perfectly
That
fine.
that's not quite right, but
Okay,
okay, go ahead. That's not
so
quite right, but that's fine.
well, hopefully that when we talk in this conversation, and I'd welcome any follow up discussions as well. Maybe I can give you the moral and the practical back, so that you can uh, enjoy the practice of IP law rather than do it while thinking it is immoral. Maybe
Well,
that's
I'm basically retired now, so it's too late.
okay.
No,
Never mind.
I do a little bit, but no. I actually enjoyed my practice because I was good at it. And when you're good at a skill, it's it's pleasurable. But I just recognized what my role was. My role was to aid people to navigate a legal system. And it's like if you're a defense attorney and you're defending someone from a drug crime, in a free society, your job wouldn't exist. But given that there is a drug war, you need defense attorneys. So you're doing a good job given that it exists. So can you take pleasure in that? Sure, but then you're regretting the fact that your job even has to exist. The same thing with a tax attorney. Like I can help corporations um, try to minimize the tax burden, and I can be good at that, and I can take pleasure in that, and I'm contributing value given the tax system. But the tax system is the immoral thing that drives the existence of this career. Or like if you're an oncologist, you're a doctor trying to, you know, you're trying to cure cancer. Well, if we could achieve a world without cancer, you oncologists would not be needed anymore. But given that there's cancer, your job is necessary. That's how I ended up viewing my job as a patent attorney, and I was good at it in those confines. So I was able to compartmentalize and think of, okay, ethically should or politically should this field exist, or should these laws exist, with what's a good career to practice in. And yeah, for me it was a good career and I was good at it and I enjoyed that part of it. I enjoyed the technological parts. I enjoyed interacting with creative people and with inventors and learning about technology and seeing how it interplays with capitalist private entrepreneurial companies and all that. So, and by the way, I wanted to mention earlier, this is again yet another side. You and I keep having tangents, but I will concede that there are some weak arguments for the abolition of IP, like, oh, information wants to be free and this kind of stuff, although there's a germ of truth in some of that. But there are terrible arguments criticizing people like me. Like, you will have libertarians or objectivists say, oh, well, you're a communist because you think ideas should be commonly owned. I mean, that's just bad arguing because it presupposes property rights. I mean, we have to get to the core of definitions, principles, rights, property, that kind of stuff to even get to this issue. You can't just say you're a commie. I mean, in my view, intellectual property is evil because it's socialistic. It is communistic in the sense that it's an institutionalized way of interfering with and taking private property rights. So then the question really is, what are private property rights? How do we justify them? And what are their contents, right? That's
Yes.
ultimately the question, I think.
And by the way, I would never call you a communist. I would, where I disagree with you is that the way to defend property rights is not to torpedo intellectual property rights. So I'm going to make that case, and so
Okay.
it's probably
Okay.
so. But my point is, if you if you since you support property rights in tangible things, but not in inventions and books and whatnot, uh, in my mind, there's no difference between the two. And
Right.
if you attack one, you're actually playing into the hands of the left, who are happy to take both down. And that's not the reason why I support it. To me, there either is a moral case or not. But in thinking that you're defending property rights by attacking intellectual property rights, you're actually playing into the hands of the leftists. That doesn't make you a
Yeah,
leftist, but you're
yeah.
playing into their hands.
Well, the one problem with that comment is that, the left doesn't oppose intellectual property rights, and communist states have patent and copyright laws. So it's not like it's a commie thing to oppose IP rights.
Well, without going into the weeds there, but even the Soviet Russia that had a kind of a patent system, it was never the individual that owned it. It was a weak. It was never
Mm,
about the individual. But maybe that's going into
I
areas where we
mean,
can.
you could say the same thing about, owning a farm. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's how their property system worked, but their property rights included patent rights. They weren't opposed to that at all, because, and I believe ultimately because the intellectual property mistake stems from the Marxist labor theory of value, which I think Rand inadvertently bought into because of the Lockean, the related Lockean mistake of the labor theory of property. So it's like both sides focus. I mean, look, Ayn Rand was good at exposing dichotomies and false choices, and I think she bought into one of them, which was, um, like they all bought into this idea of labor as being this essential concept and category that has moral implications.
But
And I
the
think
point,
it's led to communism and mass murder and, all kinds of horrors.
true, but there's an error in that, and I just want to clarify that. Uh, we all know that rights, both intellectual and um, tangible, started off on a really bad way with monopolies from the crown and things like that. So the origins are very murky. But uh, in more modern times, modern including the Lockean era, the 1690s and what have you, the, the the people who were the natural rights philosophers of the Lockean type, they were focused on labor, and they never really justified the source or the nature of property. To them, it was a very intrinsicist thing, like either it's from God or it's something inherent in human beings and all of that.
I
So it was
agree.
a very
I don't
intrinsicist.
disagree. Yep, I don't
So
disagree with that. Yep.
so Rand figured that out, and she actually she is not on the labor theory of value. I think it's this is where there's a lot of commonality between Rand and Locke, but she parts company with them in that labor theory of value. So to say that she is part of that tradition is correct, but for her it's about value creation, and it was
Well,
not. And may I just complete the
yeah,
thought?
go ahead, go ahead.
Then the next phase was the Benthamite era. Actually, from Kant was sort of coming into his own right after in the late 1700s, and then Bentham comes along, and he creates this new religion, if you will, of the greatest good for the greatest number, the utilitarian mindset, and he's the one who actually brings scarcity as the source of value and therefore the source of property. So you have either scarcity or labor or value. And,
Yep.
and then, of course, Marx says, well, it's labor that is scarce. And so he's sort of blending the Benthamite view with the Lockean view, and then he's going off on his horrible
Mm.
labor theory of value. So
That's
Rand is,
interesting. That's interesting. I would disagree with that, with part of what you said, but like I don't think that you can attribute recognizing the fundamental nature of reality being that we are human actors with physical bodies, which Ayn Rand herself recognized when she distinguishes that. She says we're not ghosts. We have actual physical, tangible human bodies. We live in the real world. We're not ghosts. Um, Recognizing that we employ scarce means, which is an Austrian Mises concept, which is true, is undeniably true. There's nothing like anti-intellectual or materialistic about this recognition that we employ scarce means, and that has certain implications. This is what economic analysis is about, implications of acting with scarce means. So we do live in this kind of world. Even Rand wouldn't disagree with that, I believe.
Yes, but
So
for
that's
Rand,
not mystical. That's not anti-intellectual. That's not monist. It's undeniably true that we live in a world of scarcity.
except that it is superficial in the sense that it. So since you quoted Rand, Rand, man is a unity of mind and body.
I agree with that
So,
completely, by the way.
so
And by the way, Mises wouldn't disagree either because we have will, we have choice, we are actors, not behaviors. But go ahead.
well, will is an approximation, but let's say so mind and body, and therefore that is so when you start with that, then you recognize that the root of all property is intellectual, whether it's a farm
I
or
don't. Okay,
so
this is where let's stop right there because when you say the root, well, define what you mean by property.
fair enough. But what I'm going to show in the next few minutes, hopefully, is that when you it's a mistake to lump Rand into the labor theory of value. That
No, I said,
misses the point.
but it's the labor theory of property. So Locke had the labor theory of property that led eventually, in my view, to the cousin and related view of labor theory of value. And by the way, some Randians that support IP, I'm not blaming you for this, but some people, they will repeat things that are very labor theory of value related, not property. Like they'll say, well, if you work hard at something, you deserve a profit. Well, that is communist. That is socialist. You do not deserve anything. No one deserves a profit for working hard, right? Even in physics, work is motion through a distance. It's not just pushing against a wall. And if you embark on an endeavor and you work hard at it, it might fail. There's always a possibility of failure. No one deserves a profit because a profit is the excess money you have left over after people pay you for services or goods that you sell or perform, and that means that they have to pay you their property, but they own that. So to have a property right in a profit would mean a slavery claim, a right of ownership over other people. It means you have a right to an income. It's like saying I put money into Social Security, so I have a right to a payment. No, you don't, because that requires the government to tax uh, workers, right, to pay me my Social Security payments. And even if the government calls it a property right, it doesn't matter. So my point is that you can't. When you say people deserve to be paid for their work, that is actually completely false, and that is hearkening back to and based upon the labor theory of value, which is Marxian and false.
But
And
that is
Randians
but that is not
sometimes do that.
but that is not the point that I'm making at
I,
all.
that's fine, but
So
some of
so
your some of your compatriots do that sometimes.
well, I would say that that we need to get to the fundamentals. And so, if man is a unity of mind and body, then the, the and man is dealing with material values in the real world. So it comes down to
No, 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 no. So here's what
so
hold on. He deals with material
Stephan,
objects,
if you don't
not
mind,
values.
you should let me finish the point because
All right, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
otherwise, you took it in the direction of profit, which is not anything that I said. So the fact that man is unity of mind and body,
Hmm.
then it comes down to you have to get to what is the root of property. That's what we started talking about. You mentioned
True.
you mentioned scarcity, and that is a cornerstone of your criticism. If you start with scarcity, then you're right. If it's all about scarcity, then intellectual property it falls into a different category. It's not scarce. So all of that goes into a different category. But that's not my case at all. So in my mind, scarcity is a superficial sort of a it's actually an invalid concept, which I will get to in just a minute. But that's to me, when you start with that, you get yourself in a lot of trouble because you haven't gone to the root. So if scarcity is your root, and I can say that there's something more fundamental than that you're missing, and because of that, you have taken the wrong approach towards IP. That's my position, and that's what I'm hoping
Right.
to show in a few
Right.
minutes.
Give me a second. I'll let you continue in a second. I'm going to want to pause this for 3 minutes to go take a bathroom break. Are you okay
Fair
with
enough.
that?
Yes,
But I got distracted actually. What I was objecting to, and not to disrupt your chain of logic, was your use of this Randian concept of values with a plural values, like treating it as a noun. That's where I think I fundamentally disagree. And we can talk about that, and I'll let you continue. But let me pause just for 3 minutes to go have a bathroom break, and I'll come right back. Are you okay with that?
absolutely.